Welcome back to Physical Anthropology. Today we're looking at Chapter 9, the early hominins. Our topics for today include early hominin evolution, explaining what bipedal anatomy requirements are, who Lucy was, as she's basically the missing link in our fossil history, looking at changes in skull and dentition of hominins, then using 5 different hypotheses to explain why hominin evolution occurred, and finally looking at some examples of specific early hominin genuses and species. So we left off with primate evolution, and we looked at this lovely chart that shows that humans right here share a common ancestor with chimpanzees 9 million years ago. So what we're going to focus on today is this branch right here, the branch that led to humans. So what is a hominin? This group includes modern day humans as well as all of our extinct bipedal ancestors. There is also some debate on whether we should include chimpanzees in this group because most of the time we use hominins to refer only to those organisms that are fully bipedal. However, some of our extinct ancestors were bipedal, but also still were able to climb in trees. So then should we include chimpanzees as well? Chimpanzees would be the only living examples of a member that could be in this group, because the next closest relative, the gorilla, is definitely still a knuckle walker and would not be considered a hominin. So we're going to investigate what was this last common ancestor with the chimpanzee. Again, it was about 9 million years ago, and we're going to try to find fossils that exist after that time period. 2 key questions we want to answer is, where did humans evolve first? So basically, what continent did their ancestors come from, as well as which of our modern day traits evolved first? Was it our large brains or was it bipedalism? Now, back in week 1, we talked about scientific method and how a scientific method can be applied to the science in anthropology. So if you're a scientist and you're trying to investigate something, you need to collect data that either supports or refutes your hypothesis. So let's say that our hypothesis is that the big brains evolved first. Well, if we believe this, then what would happen is we would look at the fossil record to find evidence of organisms of human ancestors that show that they had big brains. So we would look for something that has a large cranium, but the rest of their body, basically their legs and their feet, would still show evidence of arboreal or knuckle walking rather than being bipedal. So that's how we would get evidence to support our theory. Now, if we're incorrect, then we would have to revise our hypothesis and try again. So what are we going to be looking for if someone is bipedal, or if the ancestor is bipedal? So in this chart, we're comparing the human on the left, which is a fully bipedal obligate biped, meaning that's our only method of locomotion, versus the chimpanzee on the right, which is actually a non-obligate biped. They can stand up and they can walk around on 2 legs temporarily, but it's not their normal method of locomotion. They prefer to knuckle walk. So a couple of things that we're going to find here is we're going to see that the position of the foramen magnum actually changes. So the foramen magnum is the hole in the back of your skull where your spinal cord exits. And in a human, it is going to be positioned directly beneath the cranium. And that's because when we stand upright, our neck is below our head. And so that is where the spinal cord exits. However, if you're a quadrupedal animal, the foramen magnum is going to be more towards the back of your head, because the back of the head is where the spinal cord would exit. So looking for where that hole is it directly below the skull, or is it more slightly behind the skull? Next, if we look at the limbs, in general, our ape-like ancestors would have longer upper limbs because they're still potentially using brachiation in the trees, versus if you're fully bipedal, you don't need the long forelimbs, you would have shorter forelimbs. Another interesting thing would be the S curve of our spine. So our spinal vertebrae have this S-shaped curve. Basically, it curves out a little bit at the neck and then back inwards at the lumbar area. So why is it doing that? It's doing that because it needs to support the weight. Okay, so you've probably heard of people having lower back pain, and you can have lower back pain depending on the arrangement of your vertebral column. But if you have this knuckle walking type of locomotion, you actually have a C curve. So you don't have that inwards curve of the lower lumbar vertebrae. Another idea is the size and shape of those vertebrae. So again, those lumbar vertebrae, your lower back, they do have a lot of weight on them. So they tend to be quite thick and robust if you're bipedal. Finally, we're looking here at the pelvis. The pelvis is a bowl shape in the human. So you can see it's quite short and very large ilium, which is this top portion that kind of looks like an ear, like an elephant ear. So that's quite large and broad. It's supporting some of the organs that are above it. Plus the way that the femur is going to be connected is going to be very important for our locomotion. In comparison, our quadrupedal relatives have a much longer, thinner pelvis. And then now let's look at the femurs. So speaking of the femurs, you can see that if you are a knuckle walker, you kind of have this curved looking femur. Oops, let's go back one more. Okay, so it has a curved looking femur, while the human has a much straighter femur, but it is angled inwards. So the knees are going to be directly below the body to help support and balance. So there's a slight angle here where the top of the femur, where your hip is more outwards, it's more lateral to your body, while the knee is more medial towards your body. Then we have the actual feet. So if you look at the foot, we know that humans have a foot arch. Okay, that's to help with the shock absorption when you're running. We have a very large calcaneal bone, which is your heel. And we also have, our toes are used to push off, so we don't have an opposable toe. In comparison over here with the chimpanzee, it still has an opposable toe because they do still use that for grasping branches, and they don't have the same large heel that we do. Okay, so to answer that question of what came first, the large brain or the bipedalism, we finally got our answer in 1974 when this discovery of the first Australopithecus afarensis was found. So Australopithecus afarensis is an ancestor that lived over 3 million years ago, and it was found in Africa. And basically they named her Lucy. So they found this skeleton on the left. You can see all the bones that remain. It was a fairly complete skeleton for such an old fossil. Usually the older the fossil, the less bones we find, because a lot of the bones degrade or break down. Even the fossilized stone portions can break up and, erode over time. So the fact that they found so many of the bones was amazing. And very importantly, they found both parts of the skull as well as parts of the leg. So when we saw the pelvis and the femur, we were able to determine that this individual was in fact bipedal, because the femur and the pelvis shape are much more similar to a modern day human than they are to a knuckle walking ape. In addition to that, because of the fragments from the cranium and the jaw, we were able to see that the jaw and the skull were still very much ape-like. So this individual still had quite a large jaw that sticks out like modern chimps have, and they still had a relatively small brain. Their brain was a little bit bigger than modern chimps, but not anywhere near the size of a modern human. So this was the conclusive evidence that in fact bipedalism came first, and that we were able to walk upright before we got the larger brains that modern humans are associated with. In addition to that, they found some fragments in other fossils of the opposable toe. So they were able to see that this individual, while it was bipedal, it was still able to climb in the trees as well. So they still had an opposable toe, unlike modern humans. The other fossil I talked to you about in a previous lesson, the Laetoli fossils, those were the trace fossils found in volcanic ash. They belong to members of this species, the Australopithecus afarensis. And because of the Laetoli footprints, we're able to determine that in this species, the males and the females are of different sizes. So Lucy, this is a female, she was only about 3.5 feet tall or so, while the male counterpart would be much closer to 5 foot tall. So again, let's compare the idea of this Australopithecus versus the idea of a more bipedal species like Homo erectus. So what would be some differences? So there are definitely some differences here. We have some features in the head that are very much more ape-like. We have the prognathic jaw. We have a much smaller cranium here. We also have a very wide barrel-like chest, while with the more human-like ancestor of Homo erectus, we're going to have a more narrow chest. We're going to have a much larger brain. In fact, the cranial capacity of Homo erectus is around 900 cubic centimeters, while for the Australopithecus, it's between 300 and 500. And just so you know, an average chimpanzee is closer to 300, so definitely much smaller there. In terms of their pelvis, the pelvis is starting to look more human, but it is not quite the same shape as those in the genus Homo. And if you look at its femur is getting more straight, but it is not quite the same shape as that of the genus Homo either. And its foot did not quite have the same type of arch, so it didn't have quite that extreme arch that we have to help with the shock absorption. And it did have still very long toes, including an opposable toe, while we do not have the opposable toe anymore. And that basically covers the comparison of those two species. Okay, so in this picture, what I like about it is it's showing you a chimpanzee, two members of Australopithecus, as well as a modern human. So you can see the modern human is taller. That skeleton probably looks quite familiar to you. The difference between Lucy and this other individual in this picture is that that one is supposed to be a representative male. So you can see that the male is larger in size than Lucy is, but clearly they look more human-like in terms of their skeleton than the chimpanzee does, especially in the legs and how the femur is oriented, in their pelvis, and then even in their feet, though not quite as much. So it's very much a transitional fossil. That's what we refer to as a missing link, where it shows evidence of the transition from this more ape-like skeleton to the more modern human skeleton. So what are some other things that I want to point out to you? Let's look at the pelvis again in more detail. So this very long, thin pelvis is typical of apes, especially the apes that are walking quadrupedally, like the chimpanzee and the gorilla, while Homo sapiens has this much broader bull-like pelvis. And then you can see that the Australopithecus is right in between. When we look at the feet, this opposable toe, the opposable hallux is what it's called, is very distinct in the chimpanzee. Modern day humans don't have it at all. But if you look at Australopithecus, there is still slightly larger gap there than what you find in modern humans. And then in this bottom left graph, there are several different example species, but the main difference I wanted to point out is the differences between the males and the females in terms of their body size and their height. So when you belong to Australopithecus, there's quite a large difference between the males and females. The males are going to be taller, they're going to be heavier. The females are maybe only 60 to 70% of the body weight of an average male, and only about 70 to 80% of their height. In comparison, modern humans, we do still have a little bit of difference between males and females on average. However, females are about 92% the height of the average male. So we're pretty close. There's not that much difference. And there's definitely overlap depending on what ethnic group you come from, whether you're tall for your ethnic group or not. Okay, so let's look at some of the skull features. I mentioned before the idea of the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is that hole at the base of your skull. And the Australopithecus would have a foramen magnum at the bottom of its skull, just like the human, indicating its more upright posture. The dental formula is that of the modern human, 2, 1, 2, 3. However, its molars were significantly larger than modern day humans. So the jaw and the teeth were larger, and especially some of the subspecies. So the Australopithecus category includes multiple other species. And one example, kind of an extreme example here, is an individual that used to be called Australopithecus boisei. They've actually since renamed it to Paranthropus. So Paranthropus because it is so distinct, but it is very closely related to these Australopithecines. And this guy, basically, look at the size of his jaw, it's huge. So this gigantic jaw was used to grind plant material that it was eating. And so it had massive molars. You can see these gigantic molars, and it had very strong musculature to allow it to close its jaw. Maybe you remember the image of the gorilla I showed you in a previous lesson, and that the gorilla also had this sagittal crest at the top of its skull. That's because it's a location for muscle attachment, and the muscle that goes all the way down to the jaw is able to help close the jaw very strongly when you are grinding plant material. We know that there's been an increase in brain size over the course of human evolution. And let's start at all the way at the right. We can see that the chimpanzee, about 350 cubic centimeters, that's the modern day chimpanzee. Australopithecines were in the 400 to 500 range. While when we get to Homo habilis, that's going to be much larger there. And then Homo erectus, even larger in the 900s. And then modern day Homo sapiens are right around 1400 cubic centimeters. So the increase in brain size over the course of evolution is a very strong pattern. We also see it in primates in general. So the image in the middle, this graph is just showing you where different groups of primates fall in terms of their brain size compared to their body size. So in general, we expect that the more intelligent a species is, the larger its brain will be compared to its body size. It is important to take the body size in consideration because something like an elephant has a huge brain, but they're not considered to be more intelligent than the average ape. So apes do in general fall higher up on this chart in terms of intelligence. And then if you look at Homo sapiens is right here. So they're kind of like off the chart. Everyone else sort of falls along this line, but Homo sapiens, there's that huge jump in terms of our brain size compared to our body mass. And then all the way on the left, I just wanted to show you some differences in the brain anatomy. So the very top brain belongs to something like a lemur. You can see that while the lobes are all there, all these different lobes have different functions. Frontal lobe is the one that we usually associate with things like critical thinking, decision-making, abstract thinking and planning, problem solving. So frontal lobe is really important for intelligent decision-making, especially about planning for the future. These other lobes are more like sensory information, hearing, vision. And notice that for the lemur, there's still a large olfactory bulb as well because they do still use their sense of smell. In comparison, when you get to a typical monkey, its olfactory bulb is much smaller, its frontal lobe is much larger, the other lobes are still there as well. And then once you get to chimpanzee, this chimpanzee brain looks very similar to what a modern day human's brain looks like. So in terms of the anatomy and the proportions, they're very similar. The only difference is the total size. So our frontal lobe is going to be very, very large. Our occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes are still there. They're still used for sensory information. Our olfactory bulb is very, very small. And then the difference again between the chimp and the modern human would just be that this same shape of a brain would be significantly larger, almost 4 times as large. So why did hominin evolution occur? We actually have 5 different hypotheses trying to explain it. So let me go through each of them with you. The first one is the aridity hypothesis. The idea is that our ancestors would have lived in the forest, but because of climate change, there was a reduction in the forests and an expansion of the savanna. So basically the environment got drier. That's what aridity means. It means it got drier. There wasn't enough water to support large plants like trees. Instead, it became kind of like a grassland. That's what the picture on the right is. It's a savanna. And if this is now your new environment, you can no longer live in the trees. You have to become basically a ground ape. And you can't just hide up in the trees or eat things in the trees. You have to adapt to this new situation. And bipedal locomotion would be a better way of getting around. It would also allow you to stand upright and to look around at the horizon to see things like predators or prey. And it just is a better mode of survival. The second hypothesis is the turnover pulse hypothesis, which said that there was extreme and rapid climate change, which put a lot of pressure on those organisms that have very specific diets. So specialist eaters that only eat one type of fruit or one type of plant would be in a very stressful situation. They wouldn't be able to find enough food. However, if you are the type of animal that is a generalist that can eat many different things, plants and berries and nuts and small animals and large animals, and basically being an omnivore was a very useful trait. So you could eat anything you could find, you're going to survive better. The third hypothesis is the forest hypothesis, which explains why the common ancestor between humans and chimps switched from arboreal to bipedal without knuckle walking as an intermediary phase. So it's just a slight contrast to that savanna hypothesis. There's something called the variability selection hypothesis. This one said that long-term environmental unpredictability influenced our adaptations. So again, it was the idea that we needed to survive no matter what happened to our environment. So it's changing, and it wasn't just the diet, like what we saw with the turnover pulse, but other types of behavioral adaptations, which require things like big brains, tool use, and again, the ability to walk around. And then the last example is the pulsed variability hypothesis, which is that human evolution was influenced by the aridity and the humidity, specifically of the deep lakes in East Africa. So the evidence for this is that quite a few of the fossils of these early hominins are found in East Africa, specifically around these original lakes. So now let's look at some specific ancestors. In this chart, you can see different examples of fossils that were found in various locations of Africa, such as South Africa or Ethiopia. And you can also see, based on the left, how many millions of years ago it's estimated that these organisms lived. So you can see there's going to be quite a few Australopithecine species. And we're not going to go through all of them, but we will pick a couple of specific examples. So we're going to look at one of the oldest fossils ever found from 7 million years ago. Then we'll look at Aurorin, which was about almost 6 million years ago, then Ardipithecus, and then some Australopithecus species. So this earliest hominin fossil you can see in this image was evolving around 6 to 7 million years ago. Its cranial capacity is only 360, which is basically the same size as that of a modern chimp. It does have these large canines, and we're not sure if it was bipedal or not because we didn't find enough of its skeleton. I mentioned earlier that most of the fossils we find that are this old are often the skulls because the other bones tend to disintegrate and break up over time. So we don't always find enough to put together a full skeleton like we did with Lucy. The other example is the Aurorin, which I do not have pictured, but that one is going to have smaller cheek teeth. It still has very much ape-like canines, but based on the evidence of the skull, we do believe that there was some bipedalism evolution happening there because of the location of the foramen magnum. Okay, so Ardipithecus. Now, Ardipithecus is about 4.5 million years ago, still small brain, so 300 to 350 cubic centimeters, but this one was evidence of bipedal. So this is even older of a fossil than Lucy was. What often happens with scientific evidence is that more data is collected over time. And Lucy's fossil was found in the 1970s, but it's been like 50 years since then. So we have found new fossils and new evidence, which has pushed our evidence of bipedalism further back in time. So now we know that Ardipithecus also was a bipedal ancestor. It did still have that opposable hallux, just like we saw with Australopithecines, where it was able to climb in the trees as well. So here's a review question for you. The aridity hypothesis argues that the expansion of blank drove early hominin evolution and diversification. So what was it that expanded? It was the grasslands. Next, the blank hypothesis states that long-term environmental unpredictability led to morphological and behavioral adaptations. So what was that one called? That was the variability selection hypothesis. And lastly, the turnover pulse hypothesis states that blank eaters faced high rates of extinction during the ice ages. Was it A, generalist, B, insect eaters, C, fruit eaters, or D, specialist eaters? And the correct answer actually should be the specialist eaters were the ones that went extinct. So let me correct that for you real quick. So as I stated, it's actually the specialists that were undergoing extinction. So let's make that correction there. That would be the correct answer. Okay, next, let's look continuing at the genus Australopithecus. We do see varying degrees of arborealism versus bipedality depending on which specific species we're observing. But the big picture that I wanted to show you is that there's actually two groupings within this genus. There's the gracile versus the robust species. So the gracile were a more slender, less rugged type of hominin. Their skeleton would have thinner bones. Their face, like I said, was still quite ape-like, but their teeth weren't as large as that of the robust versions. And so two examples are Australopithecus afarensis, which was the species of Lucy, as well as Australopithecus africanus, which is the image in this picture. This is the tongue child, which lived between 2 to 3 million years ago. Now, the second grouping, the robust species, were a type of hominin that had evolved to have very large jaw muscles and very large teeth, specifically to grind plant matter, things like roots and tubers. That's the image I showed you previously, but it has been renamed, so it's now in the genus Paranthropus, but sometimes in older books, you'll still see them referred to as Australopithecus. So that image specifically is the Paranthropus boisei, and you can see how large its jaw is, how robust it is compared to that of Lucy or the tongue child. Now, how do all of these different hominins relate to each other? It can be very difficult to figure out the exact evolutionary relationship, and that's because we mentioned previously that species means that you can interbreed with each other. But how do you know if someone interbred with another individual millions and millions of years ago? Because these fossils are so old and they're made out of rock, there's no DNA in them anymore. So there's no way to extract DNA and look at genetic relationships. So the best thing we can do is usually based on physical comparisons and estimating if they would be similar enough to be the same species or not. But at the top of this page, what we're looking at is potential evolutionary relationships. And you can see that one thing we're sure of is that the Ardipithecus is definitely the most ancestral of the different groups in this image. We also know that then the Australopithecines evolved and then they started to branch out. So there were multiple Australopithecine species that existed at the same time, and we're not quite sure which branch gave rise to modern day humans. So in the first image, it's actually number 5, which leads to number 9. Number 9 is the human. So number 5 is Australopithecus africanus. So that's one possible explanation, is that Australopithecus africanus is our direct ancestor. On the other hand, several of these other images group us with number 4. Okay, and number 4 is the Australopithecus garryi. So it's possible that that one is actually our direct ancestor. But until more evidence comes out and more fossils are found and potentially even some DNA, it can still be under debate. The last piece of information I will tell you about this grouping is the evidence of tool use. So we talked about how they have relatively small brains and they were bipedal, but we also think it's possible they were using stone tools. We do see evidence of tool use in modern apes like chimpanzees, usually quite primitive tools, things like sticks, maybe a rock to crack some nuts. And unfortunately, those things don't necessarily fossilize, like a stick won't fossilize and a rock won't look like any other rock. However, in the Alduin technology, what we see is deliberate cracking of these rocks so that flakes would come off and provide you with this sharp edge right here. So this is deliberately done. It's not an accidental type of thing. And we have found evidence of these stones, but in general, stone tool use was mostly associated with the genus Homo. So there's debate on whether these more primitive hominins like the Australopithecines, whether they in fact also used these primitive stone tools, and it is possible. So they might have been using it to scrape meat off of bones or to crack wood or any other hard object like a bone. But we're going to have to continue to investigate that. Okay, and that does wrap it up for this chapter.